congratulations to all of the teams. Of course, as we said before, address the panel as a whole if you can, and that's our preference, I think. And without any further ado, I want to invite the Prime Minister to open up this debate. Here.
Hi, before I start, just want to check I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. At the top of my speech, I want to note one very significant thing. Republican states, red states, will vote Republican anyways, regardless of whatever the Republican National Party pursues. There are three reasons for this. One, historical partisanship has meant that these states will always keep on voting Republican. Two, I would know that there's a lack of an alternative. That is to say that the Democratic Party is not a party that's going to win votes over there, especially because of cultural issues like the Democratic Party's stance on things like gun rights, on taxes, abortion, so on and so forth. The third thing I would note is that the Democratic Party, with the inclusion of AOC, Bernie Sanders, etc., is moving further towards the socialist left, and there is no way in fucking hell that these people vote for that party. So Republican senators, governors from these states will likely win their elections anyways. What is this debate then about? There are two interests of the Republican Party that we want to talk about. The first one is that we want to appeal to moderate voters and key demographics in swing states so that we ensure electability in the long run so that we can win future presidential elections and so on and so forth. The second thing I want to note is that the Republican Party still has an interest, while the Democrats are in power, to pass key legislative agendas of their own or block certain legislation that especially the left of the Democratic Party is supporting right now. The second thing in terms of framing I want to note at the top of my speech is that the chances that this will happen, that this investigation will happen anyways, are very high. The Democrats have already been pushing for the Mueller investigation to be turned into a criminal investigation and for him to be prosecuted. I would note, secondly, that the Democrats, after last night, have won the House, the fucking Senate, and the presidency, and they have nobody stopping them doing so. And lastly, I would note that the events of last night, the rioting that happened, the attacks on democracy, the fact that lots of black people are dying because of white supremacist attacks, all of that has increased the motivation for them to pursue this anyways. So what do we push for? What do we support on our side of the house at OG? I would know that Donald Trump still has 2 weeks in the presidency. During these 2 weeks, we say the Republican National Party should push for impeachment in both houses of Congress and push for criminal prosecution. If this time is not enough, and it likely will not be enough, we say that the Republican National Convention and other forums should be used to publicly push for this by different people within the Republican Party and support any sort of democratic efforts to criminally prosecute him. 2 points in this speech then. Firstly, let's talk about electability. I want to talk about a couple of claims here. One, I want to note that opposition might claim that Donald Trump has very popular, got a lot of votes. But, and I want to note this crucially, Joe Biden was not a popular person. He was somebody who's like viewed as senile. Lots of people attacked his attitudes towards the black community, so on and so forth. And lots of people thought that he was an establishment-run candidate. However, the Democrats still won overwhelmingly, got the most amounts of votes possible, like ever achieved in US presidential election history, by mobilizing people, especially in swing states, based specifically on the fear of another Donald Trump presidency. That is to say that these voters, people who were apathetic in the past, did not vote, did not like Democrats, went out in their fucking millions in Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, because they were scared shitless, not only of Donald Trump, but of what Donald Trump as a man, as a brand, represented for them and for their interests. That is to say that even if the Republican Party continues supporting Donald Trump in the future, they are likely to still be very fearful of Republican candidates in the future who support the same policy agenda platform, use the same rhetoric in the future. We say that these people also were wary of Donald Trump's response to the pandemic and attitudes and policies towards minorities, so on and so forth. So they really don't like you. And at some point, the Republican Party needs to make an effort to say, we don't like him either, try to differentiate themselves from him as much as possible, try to create a new policy agenda, new networks, and so on, so that they can at the very least stand a chance of getting the votes of these people. I would note that even if you don't get the votes of these people, if their fears are sufficiently mitigated, that at the very least ensures things like them not voting in elections, therefore increasing your chances of winning these elections because your voter bases are still there. The second thing I want to note at the top of this again is the demographic shifts that have occurred within the American population. The number of black people within America is rising, the number of Latin Americans is rising. And while yes, you got some support from the Cubans in fucking Miami, you are not getting broad-based support within these minorities. I would also note that we accept that the Democrats used to have an advantage within minority communities already historically, but I would note key things right now which have happened, which is one, these people and the Gulf has increased manifestly. Even apathetic minority voter groups like Black poor voters have come out in the scores to vote for this. We say what we should do is differentiate from Donald Trump, remove the memory of ICE camps from them, the response to BLM, the support for white supremacy groups, so on and so forth from their memories, so that at the very least we can create a new agenda, a new possibility, so that we can appease these voters at the very least, and not ensure that they permanently vote against the Republican Party, which would ensure that we keep on losing elections far into the future. At this point, I will take something from closing. If they have anything, give them an opportunity to engage.
Firstly, what exact charges are you prosecuting? And secondly, are you also prosecuting co-conspirators?
Yeah, we're fine with prosecuting him for attacks on democracy, him fixing elections, so on and so forth, trying to not get Biden into power. There are scores of charges in the Mueller report. I already said that. Okay, with regards to the third thing within this, I would note that the Republican Party faces a unique threat, which is a split within the Republican Party. Lots of moderates within the Republican Party don't want to remain part of the party, such that there is actually talk within America now of the Romney centrists shifting and making another party. I would note that one, lots of voters like these people, they have elected them in the past, and them making another party will significantly diminish your chances of even handling red states, let alone fucking swing states. The second thing I wanted to note is that even, and I want to note that opposition might claim that the most radical parts of the party will criticize you and there'll be a split. I would note that even the most conservative people like Mitch McConnell, Mike Pence have fucking come out against the events of last night, have come out against Donald Trump's attempts to not get Biden the presidency and so on and so forth. So we say that one, we prevent splits happening such that they create their own party. But two, I would note that even in the circumstance where Romney doesn't create his own party, there will still be a constant stream of criticism within the Republican Party against these sorts of policies, against Donald Trump, which makes you look like a weak party and diminishes and dilutes your support. The last thing with regards to the legislative agenda, I've already told you that Democrats have a lot of power. I would note that Biden has come in on a platform where he's saying, I want to negotiate with the Republicans, America United, so on and so forth. But at this point, if you do not negotiate with him, keep on supporting Trump, you remove incentives from this party to negotiate with you in the future. Considering that you have absolutely jack shit legislative power right now, and they have complete power over all organs of the state, I would know that you need to appease these Democrats, say that you were different from Donald Trump, so at the very least they can listen to your sensible policies when you say we oppose student loan forgiveness, so on and so forth, because of effects on the economy, or so on and so forth. There are multiple legislative agendas that affect your voters, and you owe them a duty to be represented and for their preferences to be fulfilled. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and now we invite the leader of the opposition to open up the debate for opening opposition. Here.
Hi panel, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Also, if you're visible as well, if you could switch.
Now,
right,
now only you are visible now.
Yeah, great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What the Deputy Prime Minister needs to prove in this debate is why criminal prosecution is the only way, or at least why it's the best way for the RNC to dissociate from Trump and then accrue the benefits that they claim would happen. We tell you why this will not happen in quite a lot of detail in my speech, but before that, you do not remove Trump from memory in any way whatsoever. This is going to be the first time in history when a party advocates for the prosecution of their own member. It will give Trump martyrdom because not only did the Democrats hate him, so did Republicans themselves, and the far right supporters will essentially make a field day out of this. And it will also make this extreme right a lot scarier, and the day-to-day interaction that Democratic supporters and moderates have with the far right will become far worse. Then they tell us that negotiations with Biden will become harder to do. That's ridiculous, right? First of all, because the brand of Biden is as bland as it can be, right? He's the most centric, like a centrist democratic leader that could possibly exist. Therefore, he would need to pander to those individuals that he could swing towards voting for Democratic parties later on. If he actively, in a guerrilla fashion, doesn't want to negotiate with Republicans right now, it makes him significantly more unpopular with the moderates, both Democrats and Republicans, which is not in his interest. But secondly, because Republicans right now also control key states because it wasn't a landslide victory to the point that all states voted for Democrats, and therefore they would still negotiate in order to push for policy regardless. We tell you this: Texas was a blue state for 100 years, even 40 years ago. You cannot come and tell us that the far right will always remain far right, and therefore you can do whatever you want for them. It is not in the interest of RNC to piss off the far right. On the other hand, at the moment, the Republicans are probably the weakest they've ever been. Democrats will push extremely hard to get the moderates to their side. They'll push extremely hard to make sure that this weakness is exploited. And therefore, it's a very critical juncture in which Republicans stand. And in that context, it's extremely important that they make the right move. Having said that, a few things. First, advocating for criminal prosecution questions the Republican Party itself for all fractions of people. Because one, you admit that it was Trump, and a lot of the wrongdoings were Trump himself and not situational. That also means that A, you did not have the foresight before you backed him before presidency, but B, you did not have the capacity to keep him on a leash and allowed him not only to be undemocratic, but be criminal, right? And that really shows the extent to which the RNC is a broken political institution. This gives a terrible message, not just to moderates, but to Democrats, to the entire world, that the RNC is incapable of being a legitimate, trustworthy body. This reduces the confidence in you, but allows Democrats to exploit this nature and this narrative in ways that can hurt you critically in the next 4 years. It also creates internal divides within the Republican Party. First, because the position against Trump, unlike what you want us to believe, is not uniform. It is definitely broken even within the RNC. That splits the RNC further, right? Because a position that is this extreme also extends association that people that supported Trump are also criminal nature. More on that later. But secondly, it also means that when things go south, RNC will not be there to support you, but will push you under the bus. That will deter potential candidacies in the future, that will divide the fraction even further and create internal problems within RNC, which might be hard to fix. More important things. You tell us in an extremely assertive way that the far right will always be there for us. The reason why the far right voted for Trump and not potentially a more moderate Republican in the first place is that up until now, they felt that they had to hide their feelings and their political interests. They had to hide the fact that they're racist. They had to hide the fact that they want conservative economic policies. They hide the fact that they don't want outsourcing to happen and they hate immigrants. Trump formalized this into the political framework, and that is why they came out and voted for Trump in the first place. Given that that environment has been created and that can of worms has been opened, you cannot claim that they will simply revert back to that particular time. Here's the distinction. The RNC can do a number of things and give a number of responses that will appease the far right and still allow them to remain on their side. First is that a violent demonstration of their belief was wrong, or an extreme demonstration of these beliefs is economically problematic and doesn't allow them to do well. Second, they can also claim that the heart might be in the right place, but at the same time, the execution of Trump was problematic. They can, worst case, say that, guess what, some things that you believed in were wrong, but we as a Republican Party still believe that some aspects of you were right and are valuable to us. The second you tell them that we criminally prosecute Trump and the beliefs that he stood for, you tell them that they are also criminals, and now they become criminals in the eyes of the RNC as well. We tell you a few things. You tell them that they're un-American, and you make them feel even more disenfranchised. Right now, a lot of support, whether financial, whether lobbying, whether grassroots support or otherwise, or in terms of media, a lot of support comes from right wing. The best case scenario in your world is that this support is weakened, and you cannot go for any kind of weakness right now. Secondly, a lot of these people will no longer vote because they will feel that nobody represents them anymore, and you can lose that support. But the worst case scenario is exacerbation of violence on the moderates that will be associated with the Republican Party and not just this fraction of Republicans, and therefore that puts you in a more precarious position. Before I move on, one from closing.
So why is it a bad thing for the RNC to scapegoat Trump as being the problem at the expense of blame for the entirety of the party apparatus?
Right, because I've already mentioned that RNC could not control Trump. They backed for Trump in the first place, but also I'm telling you that these far right people matter. But more importantly, coming to why RNC cannot simply brush their hands off. coming to moderates, right? We think first and foremost, criminal prosecution is not an expectation of moderates. It's something that the extreme left expects in the first place. You cannot sway them. What moderates want is that they want a degree of stability and moderation in political aspects as well. Because at the end of the day, they want politicians to not disrupt their day-to-day life, and they want to have issue-based discussions. And criminal prosecution is an extreme that they neither appreciate but might be considered as illegitimate, as advocating for prosecution for a political party is something that the Supreme Court should decide and not something that Democrats should do. Instead, we think that instead of being extreme, there are a number of other things they can do. They can have policy shifts which the moderates can understand. You have to understand that the RNC has 4 years to redeem themselves, in which case a rash action is not necessary. But instead, you can dissociate on a policy level, on a day-to-day discussion, from the things that Trump had stood for that will allow the moderates to sway towards you as well. In the end, you never win the far left. You lose the far right and the extreme support you have from them. And you, at best, sway the middle in a very tokenistic way, but you have a risk of losing them as well. In the end, RNC does not win in any world in this debate. Thank you.
We want to thank the leader of the opposition for that speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Here.
Can you hear me, Lovro?
Yeah.
Great. I'm in the exceptionally awkward position of calling out a team from the developing world for not having enough nuance about the developed world. The far right did not singularly elect Donald Trump. Donald Trump was elected by 72 million people. Many of them voted because of disenfranchisement from an economically neoliberal system that never treated them as valid economic subjects. Many of them voted against him for him because they felt that he would be a bastion against the establishment. There were a plethora of reasons why people voted for Donald Trump, and a minute minority within them decided that they want to vote for him for things to do with racial justice, for things to do with what I absurdly call cultural issues. And a tiny minority within that showed up to the Capitol, roughly 420 people. They want to hang their hat on the whims of those 420 people, or maybe the tens of thousands that they represent, and never win an election again. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, quickly take out O's material so we don't go down with them, then weigh heavily our material against closing. First thing they said, this would be the first time you would prosecute a member of your own party. Nixon exists, read a history book. Secondly, you can still negotiate against the Democrats. The assistant House Speaker has called for impeachment, an establishment Democrat. 26 Democrats within the House have called for impeachment in the last 24 hours. By the time the speech ends, there will likely be more. This means that you cannot negotiate with them because they do not think that you have a negotiating position. It also completely ignores Taha's analysis about how this debate is not about swinging Republicans more generally. People in Alabama and people in other states will definitely vote for Republicans anyway, no matter if they prosecute Trump or not. The bigger problem was, how do you swing voters in Georgia, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania? You know, the states that you lost, both in the Senate elections, the House elections, and also the presidential elections. The third thing that they said here was, you admit it was Trump and you admit that you elected a bad leader. One, that's sort of self-evident from media coverage ranging from Fox News all the way to MSNBC. So you're literally just admitting something that's going to happen anyway. Like Taha's already showed to you that the planet universally recognizes that this was Trump's fault, and the Democrats are going to impeach him and investigate him in the Senate anyway. The question is whether you get along for the ride or whether you get off. The second thing I want to say is, just frame this appropriately. You don't have to say, we didn't realize in August 2015 when he came down the escalator that he was a bad person. What you say is literally what the leader of opposition said in the 6th minute of his speech. He has finally crossed a fucking line and he needs to be criminally prosecuted. So oddly enough, I'm using his own analysis to prove what the framing of the RNC would be on our side. The second thing that they said was about fracturing. And I want to say 2 things here. One, again, completely ignoring Taha's analysis of how there's fracturing from the centrists. People like Susan Collins, people like Lisa Murkowski, people like Mitt Romney are already in plans as we speak, going to reporting from Politico to form a separate centrist party platform. This means that you lose basically a third of your electorate and something like a fifth of all of your elected Congress leaders, the point at which you allow this to happen. Someone needs to appease them. But secondly, even people on the right wing like Marsha Blackburn and Richard Burr have condemned the protest. So again, they're in the awkward position of debating a motion where the facts of the case do not support what they're saying. People from both the right and the moderate moderate wing of the Republican Party have explicitly condemned this and have explicitly asked Trump to explicitly condemn this as well. So if anything, fracturing happens on their side. The third thing that they talked about was alienation. Now, notice at the top of my speech, I said, not all voters are gun-carrying, alt-right, pro-QAnon activists, right? Like, fuck those people. Alienate them if you want to. Because this is a tiny, tiny minority of people. Also, what will these people do exactly? Start voting for Clinton and Joe Biden? Like, realistically, in a paucity of alternatives, they're still going to vote for the Republicans. They're going to be pissed off at them for a bit. That's all that happens. The final thing that they said was that you might be associated with a criminal. Yes, so was the Republican Party of Nixon, but unfortunately, they had to do it so that they could win elections literally 2 cycles later when they elected an 2-term president in the form of Reagan. So yes, you associate ourselves with that. I mean, I don't know what to say to that. But also, like, CG's response is also fair. Like, Naomi is fair to say that you can simply strawman Trump and say this was all his fault. Like, it's unclear to me why you don't have the framing potential to do that. Quickly, our analysis. Why do we win on policy? The Republicans are completely fucked because A, they've lost on the same day both houses of Congress and all sense of moral legitimacy. This creates 2 bad outcomes. The first is that even people like Joe Biden, who stand on a unified platform legislatively, are going to tell these people to fuck off, as many people in Congress are doing over the last 24 hours, and not cooperate on anything. What does this look like? Passing student loan forgiveness policies without their consent, passing grand legislation without their consent. The possible response might be you need 60 votes in the Senate. You already have Republicans, A, who will vote for this. And secondly, a lot of this can pass through budget reappropriation. The point is that generally Democrats will now attempt to pass whoever they want. They have no incentives to play to the center. Instead of having a Merrick Garland sort of Supreme Court justice, they'll have a Alito sort of Supreme Court justice. They'll just elect far left people because they have no incentive to cooperate with a party which supports a criminal dictator anymore. So if you want these people to cooperate with you, you have to extend them an olive branch. This criminal prosecution does that. Secondly, you legitimize the politics of the left on the Democrat Party, which is even worse for the Republicans. Because who was talking about Trump inciting violence? Who was talking about Trump being a dictator who allows people with guns to come into the Capitol? Bernie Sanders, AOC, the squad for the last 4 years. And their claims have literally been legitimized by the events of the last 24 hours. So if you want to do anything about these people, it is fundamentally necessary for you to make sure that an olive branch is extended to the Democrat Party. Before I move on, I'm going to take closing opposition for engagement. Please go ahead.
Do you have any evidence that Trump is actually guilty of anything?
Yep. So it's called the Mueller investigation. There we go. So the Mueller investigation had 10 different charges against Trump, but according to an OLC ruling, Office of Legal Counsel for context, they said we're not allowed to criminally prosecute Trump, which I think is sort of important. Secondly, the Southern District of New York has launched 3 different criminal investigations into Donald Trump, and the Eastern District of New York has launched 6. Read a newspaper. The final thing that I want to talk about is why criminal prosecution specifically, which is where they attempted to do this thing of, we agree with the problem, but your solution is not correct sort of debating, right? A few reasons why criminal prosecution is crucial. A, the Democrats will stand for literally nothing less because of the reason Taha gave you. They're calling for impeachment again, and this time a criminal investigation will happen in the Senate because they have the majority in the Senate, and they need 51 votes there, which they now have with Kamala. The second reason a criminal prosecution is important is that even if it doesn't happen the next 2 weeks, as I said in response to that point of information, there are something like 11 investigations against Donald Trump as we speak, post-presidency anyway, so it's about getting along for the ride. But 3, it's about establishing a fundamental split between Donald Trump and yourself. Anything short of explicit legal condemnation will not help the party distance itself from the legacy of what was a truly horrific leader to have within your party. But finally, criminal prosecution is important because it shows to voters in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and other places that you fundamentally lost in the elections, that you do not stand for an authoritarian, dictatorial, egomaniacal idiot. You stand for values of free trade. You stand for the values of the market, the values that were the party of Lincoln's, and they will continue to perpetuate those values. This is the reasonable policy of the RNC. I am so proud to propose.
We want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and then invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for OO and also to sum up the first half of this debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Just give me a second. Timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm still very confused about one key question. Why criminal prosecution?
Because when we suggest to them there are certain alternative positions you can take, their continuous response was criminal prosecution is the strong line we need to take in opposition to Trump. Otherwise, there is no way we are surviving. I'll categorically show to you why. To all the relevant parties who might impact the future of the RNC, this is not a requirement and therefore is not something that gives them the debate. The contrast, however, the types of harms you open yourself up to as the RNC are just significantly more vast, the point at which you criminally prosecute. Therefore, those are the two frames on which we will win this debate. By the own analysis of the opening government, presumably a certain group of the conservative population will continue to vote Republican. Likewise, a certain group of the left would continue to vote Democrats. Here, I want you to note that the analysis they presented, for which we need to take a strong opposing stance, was that individuals were extremely afraid of Trump. In the vast majority of instances, that is why the possibility of them coming into the middle ground and extending the vote towards Republican is extremely unlikely. The problem is these are individuals who would in no way shift across the floor in any case, because these individuals have policies that are policy interests that are diametrically opposed to those which the RNC at any point in time would likely support, things like immigration, things like abortion laws, etc. Therefore, the biggest impact of reducing that fear by taking a very strong position against supposedly a criminal dictator are not the individuals you would get on opening government side. Note this very clearly, because that is literally the actual mechanism in their prime minister's speech that they use for this. But then who do they hope to impact here? They hope to impact the center left in many instances to get them to vote. We tell you that often you don't need criminal prosecution for the center left to vote, because they are not very strongly ideologically inclined to Biden either. The reason for which they voted Biden in any case was because these are often individuals who vote on single issues. So when they are promised things like benefits with their health care or other kinds of economic benefits, that is what they often wanted to support. They often expect things like they're prioritizing their issues, a certain brand of anti-establishment practice that is often there. I would suggest the point at which any dissociation from Trump is created, the establishment of Democrats is strong enough to push them into the side of the Republicans. Lastly, things like economic policy and other things are often particularly prioritized for them. These are reasons why they voted. The explanation and the response in DPM is that people like AOC and Sanders are often individuals who did support criminal prosecution. Well, those are people who are also opposed within the Democrat Party, where most people did not accept the Green New Deal. So again, these people fall into that small bracket of unchangeable Democrats. So for all of the explanation they give to you, there is actually no positive outcome that they create for the election that is unique to criminal prosecution. Because what did we support in alternative? We supported things like explaining why, while some of the policy and ideological positions were correct, the demonstration and implementation of that through Trump in many instances was wrong. Perhaps their heart was in the right place. The execution in this election was incorrect. And even if they are incorrect, it is not criminal. Therefore, you don't antagonize them. All three of those positions empowers the type of people that they say are currently splintered, which means that their entire premise for splintering, once again, is quite unclear. Because the risk of splintering means you don't get the RNC support. You lose out a lot of the historic and legacy supporters of the RNC. So it is not in the interest of those people to move away from the RNC for their own political futures. So the risk that they suggest, you lose on center, you lose on left, or you lose on internal inconsistency, are all not a result that is solved by criminal prosecution. But what do you definitively do, the point at which you antagonize the far right? The far right is extremely powerful for the RNC in particular. A lot of funding through promotion of things like gun laws or anti-abortion are things which have propped up a lot of very stagnant and solid power structures for the RNC historically. These are power structures which you never had to communicate with to kind of replenish the power sources. They control a lot of media in many instances through Fox News, which means they often are the flag bearers of your ideology, who are extremely important for turning elections by destabilizing identities. Essentially, this is the positive you miss out. But at the same time, these are also the most destabilizing forces within your country, which means they have the ability to instill fear in other individuals, the point at which they're pissed off. Well, right now, individuals are very scared after they stormed the presidential office. So they have the ability to impact future elections in a negative manner as well. Why is this likely to happen? The point at which you take this position. And this is where we again engage to the opening government suggestion that, you can just go along with the ride of an inevitable prosecution anyway. Two differences. Number one, if the Democrats did it, you can blame it on them that they won the election, but they still want to go ahead and prosecute our individuals who had done a reasonable job when they were in presidency. Therefore, you have a rhetorical advantage against these individuals, which rallies support for people. But secondly, advocating for prosecuting Trump doesn't mean Trump is out of the picture, which means you antagonize Trump, who is a billionaire, an individual who has a lot of money, supposedly has a lot of support in many instances within the within the Republican framework right now, which means he can not only create more splintering within that party itself, but he can rally against the exact individuals who you already antagonize. The difference of the road to prosecution, therefore, means that we maintain an ideological consistency as the RNC, where, as my previous speaker pointed out to you, you do not admit that bringing Trump into power was a massive failure. Our inability, despite having control over his fundraising, over his election platforming, over his election strategy, we are now going to say that all of those were his fault and we particularly want to leave. This becomes more clear because the grounds for prosecution are often not definitive. Before I proceed to the last part, CG, do you have a point?
If Trump is punished for something, for example, sent to jail, given a fine, kicked out of the Republican Party, essentially, how likely is it that he's able to run again for the Republican Party and hurt them again?
I don't think he's going to be able to run on our side either. Like I said, if you denounce him right now, you empower other individuals within the Republican Party, therefore it is not relevant. In any case, what we said then was that it is particularly bad on the RNC and its ability to inspire confidence, where you were an ideologically consistent party, which is why you had a legacy of voters all along, is what you immediately lose. At the same time, the Democrats are able to criticize not just Trump, but the RNC overall, which means while short-term harms had arisen from Trump's presidency, you create a long-term image of an inconsistent and unreliable political entity. The reason why this becomes particularly crucial and harmful in the future is because the ability to inspire confidence is reduced, the point at which you have essentially identified ideological similarity to Trump, people in the far right who currently align with him, as people who are criminals. These are already people who have been alienated in many ways because of the centralization of politics. You allow them to be significantly polarized. You allow Trump to get away with martyrdom at a point where they are prosecuted by those individuals, and then you create a divide that you can never recover from. If you need to play on the margins, play in the center, but ensure you do not antagonize the right, because that is your only way to get definitive support. Glad to oppose.
We want to thank the deputy leader of the opposition and all of the speakers in the first house of this debate, and now invite the member for the government to extend this debate from Gov side. Here.
Sorry, just give me 1 second to grab a timer. I'm going to be talking about two things in my speech. Firstly, about justice and why the party has an obligation to prosecute Trump. And then secondly, about the long-term distancing from Trumpist ideals and why that is in the interest of the RNC. Getting into the first claim about why the party has an obligation to prosecute Trump, and all framing and clash is going to be integrated. Two things here. The first thing to say is that there is clear evidence that Trump has violated democracy that the party has an obligation to care about. We have tangible evidence that he violated the emoluments clause of the Constitution and accepted gifts from foreign people. It's literally the fact that he colluded with Russia to rig the election. He pushed for the collusion with Ukraine over Biden. He has incited violence publicly against state officials, and he's massively violated tax codes. We have irrefutable evidence that this has taken place, and people in the establishment know this. The party has an obligation to care about this for two reasons. Firstly, the success of the party itself and its very existence is literally attributable to the existence of a democratic system. As Rawls has said, any just rule within society also implies you have the general obligation to support the creation and the sustenance of just democratic institutions. And insofar as you literally exist because of democracy, you have an obligation to that very system itself. But secondly, more importantly, this means that the party was literally complicit in actively betraying voters. They supported a candidate who actively violated their will insofar as they were willing to support someone who violated the very tenets that were necessary for that system in the first place. So I think you not only have a duty of care to your own voters to put you into a position of power, but a duty of care to the American populace as a whole, insofar as people literally voted to put you into a position of power and to betray that. But secondly, you also owe massive reparations to minority populations who Trump actively screwed over. So historically, Trump treated the Republican Party treated Black voters and minority voters like absolute crap, where they supported things like mandatory minimum policies and just horrible broken windows policing policies that literally robbed the dignity of people. We think that by supporting Donald Trump, they further became indebted to this particular demographic of people when they supported a candidate who called out Black people and immigrants and basically just said that they were criminals, who massively normalized a culture of sexual assault. He said that we have to build a wall to be able to keep immigrants out. We think that supporting prosecution is the closest thing that you can get to achieving redress for these particular groups of people, insofar as it could bring them a sense of closure over the absolutely awful things that Trump has done. In terms of weighing this principle into the round, I don't think the front half gives you any framing about what the Republican Party should actually care about. Insofar as we provide you a metric and actually explain why the RNC has obligations, as a non-interventionist panel, you automatically have to side with the fact that the thing that the RNC should care about the most is a principle of this debate, which is sticking with principles that are actively democratic. I think that's the second extension that we're going to forward is why it's important to get a long-term distancing and a long-term ideological distancing from Trumpist ideals. So under the status quo, Trump has literally hijacked the RNC. He has supported a variety of policies and put these policies in place that actively differ from what mainstream Republicans actually like and actively supported. Mainstream Republicans placed a high level of emphasis on democracy and the sustenance of democratic institutions, based on framing that I gave earlier. A blatant disregard was demonstrated for that. The Republican National Committee is very, very neoliberal in nature. So he supported things like free trade and international institutions, whereas Trump has been massively protectionist in nature and has like just violated and contradicted democratic economic policies that were actually supported. He's also had a very highly erratic foreign policy that differed from the far more sensible stance that Republicans used to take, where he's like very hawkish in some areas and then just completely different in other areas as well. So we think crucially that distancing ourselves as a party from Trumpist ideals that differ from what mainstream Republicans actually support is contingent on supporting this idea of prosecution, because otherwise there is not a natural inclination for the party to distance ourselves from Trump, particularly from the reasons that opening opposition gives of, oh, you might be scared about alienating particular groups of voters. Number one, the party just lacks a good justification to be able to do this, because they can't use the justification of Trump is not electable when he literally, even when he lost the last election, got a very high quantity of votes. But secondly, there are just so many senators and high profile people who've taken a robust stance in favor of Trump that it's going to become hard to like get the inertia within the party and get the push to actually abandon Trump. So we think that the prosecution of Trump is a very, very useful pretext to be able to distance yourself from a lot of these ideals. Insofar as we were able to just give like a clear reason about why the party has to be able to distance herself from Trump, because he did things that were actively illegal. So what are the tangible mechanisms as to how this will help us allow us to like just remove Trump's influence in the party overall? Number one, we want to prevent Trump from running in the next general election, where clearly if he's like literally put behind bars, like he will not be able to run, but also just a very clear way that the party would be able to abandon them. Just asserts that the party's not going to allow Trump to run anyways, which seems to like contradict their own framing that the party doesn't really want to alienate voters who are traditionally Trumpist. He has literally signaled under the status quo he's planning on running. I saw multiple op-eds about that before the tournament. He has a lot of influence within the party, like economically as well, and there's a lot, and like he's secured a very loyal base because senators are scared of criticizing him. Therefore, this could actively be a possibility. Not allowing Trump to run is important because number one, he would just decrease the time that he would be in power to implement bad policies. But number two, it would also disempower the cult of personality that exists around Trump, where he just gets like massive media attention that fuels his base during the election process. But secondly, this can be a valuable form of ideological distancing if you buy Op's best case scenario. So if it is true that the party would kind of split and you would lose voters who are far right, we think that insofar as OG proves that you would probably get some more voters, it's good to not be as reliant on like extremist far right voters and actually able to gravitate to other voters who support more centrist ideals that actually align with democratic establishment. Now that I've proven this extension, I just want to give you multiple ways to frame and to weigh this into the round. Firstly, I think that front half is basically a wash for a couple of reasons. I think that number one, OG proves that they get more voters. OU proves that they get more voters. Neither team does the math or the weighing to explain why whether getting some more minorities is more important than far right people who are ultimately going to be alienated. I think that how this round unfolds is that both teams like might lose some voters, but I think that would probably wash out and become quite symmetric. I also don't think that they prove why this would be like a very long-term thing. So maybe in the next election you would lose a few voters, but it's unclear why the party ought actually care about that in the long term. I also think that the infighting argument was uncomparative on front half because some factions within the party are going to be mad under either side of the house. Why though do establishment Republicans actually care about this? Number one, these are people who care deeply about establishment ideals. They have been in the Republican Party for many years. They've been ideologically indoctrinated with things like neoliberal economic policies being good. I think that therefore they just self-selected into like an ideological paradigm where they feel like Trump has betrayed the party, where they feel like Trump has betrayed the party and they care a lot about these ideals. Note, we don't think that making your party more electable is an inherent good in and of itself, if that electability is leading to policies that actively contravene your own ideals. Secondly, these people often have an active self-interest in things like neoliberal economic policy for their own business interests. But finally, if what you care about in this debate is getting more voters, there's just a far better mechanism than opening government, because it's not a big signaling effect claim. If you literally get more moderate Republicans who are wealthy, who are now being alienated, when you're supporting policies that are actually aligned with their own lived experiences and that they actually support, rather than ridiculous Trumpism, these people are more important than minorities because they have more economic resources. They live in high numbers in swing states like Arizona. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing government.
We want to thank the member for the government for that speech, and now invite the member for the opposition to extend this debate from CO. Here.
Hi there, am I audible?
Yeah.
Wonderful. The first thing that CO are going to contribute to this debate is analysis to demonstrate why, in the absence of the RNC pushing for a prosecution, it would not have happened. Note that this will be by far the biggest contribution to this debate, for the reason that opening opposition only provide analysis to suggest that the RNC endorsing the prosecution happening is bad, whereas we prove is exclusive to the government bench of this debate, which means all of the harms of a prosecution must be solely credited to closing opposition. What is the reason why a prosecution will exclusively happen under the government bench world? The first thing to note is that Biden is on record saying that he will not push for a prosecution, which in fact structurally makes a lot of sense, given that he has framed himself as a unity candidate who wishes to heal the country as opposed to pushing for further divisions. The second reason is that the Democratic Party has a strong stance of not politicizing the Justice Department, which means if you want to do a civil prosecution against Donald Trump, it certainly won't come through the arm of the Democratic Party. And the third reason is that if you believe, like the opening government team say, that they want to push for an impeachment, which note is distinct from the criminal prosecution, how we imagine this debate would go, it is necessary to attain a 2/3 majority in order to get the conviction, which means that the Democrats know that the impeachment will not work, which means that they know that they ought not to push for it. Noting that this occurs in the context of an existingly failed impeachment, which hurt the Democrats' electability for the reason that the impeachment resulted after the Mueller investigation as inconclusive, which is our second important contribution to this debate. Noting that the government bench so far has asserted that we have a huge amount of evidence, but we do not. And in fact, that makes a lot of sense. Firstly, for the reason that the Mueller investigation, which is the only widespread investigation into Trump's wrongdoings, was inconclusive. It demonstrated that we don't actually know. But secondly, for the reason that where Trump has scope to do bad things, there are legal avenues for him to pursue those bad things as opposed to doing them extrajudiciously. And it makes more sense for him to try to insulate himself from harm by pursuing the legal mechanisms to do so. So given that there is now firstly, the establishment that the prosecution is exclusive to the gov bench, and secondly, the very real probability that the prosecution will fail and thereby incur all the harms of perception issues without actually guaranteeing any results for the Republican Party insofar as distancing themselves from Trump. Let's move on to our first positive contribution of the debate. Our claim is that unique to an investigation is the uncovering of evidence, and that evidence would reflect very poorly upon the Republican Party. Noting two things here. The first thing to note is in the scenario in which no evidence is revealed or no bad evidence is revealed, that's very bad for the RNC, for the reason that they have now pursued an overly pernicious investigation, which has demonstrated that they did so exclusively across political lines, which not only makes the Trump side of the party feel vindicated insofar as Trump is not prosecuted and thereby more likely to distance himself from the RNC and continually align with Trump, but also makes the RNC look incompetent. But the other possibility is just that information is uncovered. Noting here that this information doesn't even necessarily need to be worthy of prosecution. It merely needs to reflect poorly upon the party. What is the reason a tremendous amount of information will be revealed in the instance of a prosecution? Firstly, the process of investigation itself requires the gathering of evidence, which through the law of the United States, if it happens through impeachment, has to be revealed to the public, at least to a large extent. Secondly, Trump and his co-conspirators, who will almost certainly be involved in this prosecution to some extent, have an incredibly strong incentive to rat other individuals out and provide evidence to try to save their own skin, which means that they will freely provide evidence if it should exist. But thirdly, for the reason that once you allow Biden to be in control and you give him the go-ahead to pursue a prosecution, he's likely to be incredibly overzealous about the fashion in which he does so through the Justice Department or whatever it might be, for the reason that it reflects better on him the more overzealous he is if the RNC are cooperating, which means that there will be a wider net cast, leading to more evidence being uncovered. What are the harms of that? Importantly, I want to frame here that we don't need a successful investigation. We only require an investigation to occur in order for evidence to be revealed and harms to come out. Firstly, it just says a huge amount of bad stuff about the RNC, like a huge amount of negative information is revealed, and that will tarnish their legacy forever. For instance, having information that Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell are political criminals is very bad for them. They automatically have their entire leadership structure revealed to be incompetent. But secondly, it also means that the constant suspicion of evidence means that there is a suspicion that there is additional wrongdoing by the party. But thirdly, it also means that in the upcoming elections, they will almost certainly lose. Like in the elections in 2 years, they will lose almost all of them, which concretizes almost all of the harms you've heard from the op bench thus far. With that out of the way, let's talk about party split. The first thing we want to note is we want to paint a more realistic picture than the opening opposition team of what the party split will look like. It looks like a number of things. The first thing it looks like is Trump voters who are historically non-voters or independent voters now voting for independence again. Or secondly, it looks like them no longer supporting the party by the mechanism of voting or providing funding or campaigning for the party. It thirdly looks like things like bleeding to other parties, so other smaller parties they're now potentially voting for, things like the Libertarian Party. Or it fourthly could extremely look like members of the Trump administration splitting off and forming their own distinct party, all of which are very bad. The first contribution that we will add, which mechanizes all of the harms of this, is noting the fact that in the US context, a couple of things mean that even a very small trickle off of these Trump supporters is devastating for the RNC. The first reason is that the United States has a first past the post system, which means that, like if you lose a certain amount, that means that you've now lost to the Democrats, even if they're only 0.5% ahead of you and not getting an absolute majority. Secondly, it's for the reason that there's an incredibly tight hold on power, which means that it is very narrow margin. So if you lose anything, you lose the first past the post. And thirdly, for the reason that far-right support is centralized in swing states primarily. I'll take a POI from closing government.
Yeah, so there's literally a group of Republicans called the Never Trumpers who actively hate him under the status quo. Therefore, there's also a risk of a split under our side of the house if people become alienated because the party is not taking action against Trump.
The first thing to note is that is a pure assertion. So for the reason that the Never Trumpers have not ever said that they're going to leave the party, whereas Trump supporters have literally said they're going to leave the party. So if we want to base it off assertions, ours is much more concrete. Secondly, the question of who is more likely to leave the GOP, the outsiders who recently infiltrated or the long-standing adherents of the GOP solely falls to our side. But thirdly, there are just other ways that people like Mitt Romney can continue to stay in the GOP and distance themselves from Trump, which is the reason why it's a false comparative. Let's step through why the party split is much worse on our side of the house. The first thing to note is that we will extend this to talking about party members being likely to leave. Firstly, for all the analysis OO provides about the populace also applies to party members. Secondly, for the risk of personal blowout when information is revealed about them. And thirdly, because it directly taints the legacy and work of their time in the Trump administration. That means that individual politicians can capitalize and respond to the whims of the electorate and leave or become independents. It means that there is massively more internal party disunity, which means interpersonal conflict leads to more splitting. And thirdly, it means that the existing deep factionalism like the Tea Party is likely to be activated and leading to the members of the party leaving themselves. This debate is primarily a question of will the investigation happen? That is solely resolved by closing opposition, and we explain through the leaving of party members how it is most likely to operate.
We want to thank the member for the opposition and now invite the government whip to sum up this debate from outside. Here.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Great. Just give me 1 second. Speaker, party politics is not just about potentially winning the very next election. It's about maintaining an ideology that is amicable towards both changing demographics and future citizens. And it's also about weighing your moral and practical obligations to both yourself and other individuals. None of the rest of the debate engage you with the real nuance of what party politics means. And so CG is the only team that can win. I'm going to first respond to closing opposition, then weigh against opening teams and explain why we both win on a practical and principled level that was unresponded to by CO until hopefully wet, but then we'll have to get a POI in. They say that prosecution is an exclusive harm for the Republican Party to use because it necessarily brings about evidence that would not have existed previously. I want to point out an observation here. We were never just talking about impeachment prosecutions, although that probably is one part of what we're doing. We were also talking about things like supporting New York state attorneys who are, for example, prosecuting Trump for tax evasion within New York. So that probably does not have to do with the rest of the Republican establishment. So this framing deals with that extension because one, that is the most likely to succeed, but also two, it does not have to do with any other Republican establishment. But secondly, we think it's actually good when evidence is brought forward because it often relates to close Trump associates rather than the Republican establishment itself. Like you don't see Mitt Romney getting into like exclusive debates with like the Ukraine about like Trump's finances, for example. You see his personal lawyers going to that because obviously those are the people who we would trust, not the Republican establishment that, as OG and Naomi point out, have already said that they don't like him very much. So we suggest that it's probably unlikely that evidence is damaging towards the Republican establishment particularly. Secondly, the population does not necessarily know that the Republicans were the tipping point for why this investigation went forward. A lot of people don't know that Joe Biden did not want to prosecute them, but a lot of also is not just about impeachment prosecutions, it's also about prosecutions broadly, for example, on a state level. But finally, we suggest that it was unnecessary that the evidence was even published in the first place. In many criminal proceedings, evidence just isn't shown to the public. It's probably likely in this really high profile case where there's likely to be a jury that evidence probably isn't shown to the public as to not sway that jury. So we think it's just really unlikely that this evidence is any reasonable tipping point compared to what OO already brings you about why anyone is likely to move from the Republican Party. But finally, in first past the post systems, as they point out, you can actually disassociate the politicians who you're voting for from the party in the first instance. So that means in some instances, at least, we're probably not going to get very much change on the current ideology of particular voters. Why do we outweigh closing government or opening government and opening opposition on our side of the House? First reason is that their characterization, opening governments, of Biden and the Democrats as being like, you know, trying to trade and like make concessions to the Republicans is probably plausible in some cases, but not very many. For example, because people like AOC, Bernie are taking over more ideological hegemony over the Democratic Party. This likely implies that in some cases OG is right, but probably not all cases. Secondly, though, the far right was not necessarily always a group that was going to turn out for Biden or for Trump. Like I'm sure in most cases the far right is still going to vote, but the far right didn't turn out to vote for people like John McCain, Mitt Romney, etc. And in the same way that the left didn't always support the center left, like Bernie Bros didn't always support Hillary, we can't be totally certain that Trump supporters are always going to support the Republican Party. So it's completely unclear from OG that that was actually the trade-off. But also it's completely unclear from OO that they were necessarily going to lose all of these Trump supporters because of the mix that OG provides. Therefore, it was difficult to adjudicate a path and understand their weighing of who was most important. OG was probably right that, you know, in numerically, there were definitely going to be more people on our side that were impacted because, you know, there are probably a lot more moderates than you know, far-right lunatics, but more importantly, far-right lunatics probably give more money. So it was also difficult on a numerical money scale of who was most important on the opening half. But finally, they were just incredibly short-term and myopic about what they even valued in this debate. Because NCG also assumes this, that electoral success immediately, like in the first or second election after Trump is yeeted, is what matters the most. But that was never true of electoral politics. Before I move on to this weighing, I'll take a POI from opening opposition before I forget.
Look, if you want to sway the moderates, it is often the case that they will vote based on policies as opposed to criminal prosecution. However, you definitely antagonize people where people have not voted just because of apathy as a good enough reason. If they both are antagonistic and pull support, why is that beneficial for the RNC?
So we agree that people do often vote upon policy. That was kind of part of our case, actually, because Trump isn't really a Republican. But more importantly, moderates don't necessarily always just vote on policy. They also vote on perception about, for example, things like law and order, about caring about justice, about caring about Trump not being a racist or like not wanting Trump to be a racist, for example. We just think that's totally unclear that Republicans and moderates necessarily do vote upon policy. So why was it problematic that all other teams in the debate only cared about immediate electoral success? Firstly, because Republicans particularly, and the RNC, often cares deeply about their ideals and about trying to push for policy that is most amicable towards them. Trump was not a Republican. He supported trade protectionism. He supported, in certain instances, for example, not being a war hawk. In other instances, he supported totally being a war hawk. He did not jive with most of the policy preferences of the Republican National Committee. What this indicates to us is that he was not aligned ideologically with the Republican Party and was not pushing for their ideals as they wanted. People in the establishment, for example, like Mitt Romney, care deeply about those ideals because they've been indoctrinated to believe through political rhetoric. And like that's the reason why they want to get into politics. It's because they want to push their own ideals on the rest of society. They believe that that's the best path forward for America. And so in the instance that they have to be tethered to Trump for the rest of eternity, then it seems unlikely that they're probably going to want to be a part of that. they were going to be tethered on opposition side because Trump wants to run again. This was particular framing that Naomi gave you. He's not just going to go away on opposition side of the House. And in fact, for their case to work, they probably want him to come back to cater to the right wing again and again and again. And so what it seems to me like is that Trump is going to have the Republican Party in their back pocket for the long haul, that people like Ted Cruz are not going to want to shift immediately unless there's a prosecution on Trump, that it's going to be difficult to ideologically correlate and like stop the relation between Trump and the Republican Party in the instance that the Republican Party does not push for this prosecution. In fact, Trump's going to want to run as long as the Republican Party doesn't try to distance him from them. And so it seems as though it's impossible to get your own ideological preferences heard as the Republicans in the instance that Trump is still there. But finally, even if it was just self-interest, even if the Republican National Committee just wants neoliberalism because they want to be able to have their businesses go overseas and exploit workers, for example, Trump was also not better for that. So even in the instance that Trump gets elected more, that does not matter on their side of the House because he does not support policies that align with the interests of the RNC. On our side of the House, you're more likely to change and shift that ideological perception of the Republicans, to divorce them in the long haul from Republicans. This is particularly important because demographics are shifting into the long term to go away from the classic like old white person voter of the radical and to be more moderate and more mixed race, for example, as well as ethnicity. It's not meant that long term it's best for the Republicans. But finally, CO did not engage with the principle. Republicans had a duty to populations from which they took their legitimacy. The only reason that Republicans can even be in office in the first place is because of a two-party system that means voters are forced and pushed into picking one of two parties that they want. And so there's a duty of care to that population. The Republicans void that duty of care when they don't seek retribution for the man who went awry with American democracy, destroyed political institutions, and attempted a coup in the last week. We suggest that's a moral obligation for the Republican Party. We're very proud to propose.
We want to thank the government whip for that speech and now invite the opposition whip to sum up this debate as a whole. Here.
I'm going to start with our extension and I'm going to defend it, then I'm going to talk about closing government, then I'm going to talk about opening government. First, on our extension. We get a few attacks, some of them from closing government, some from opening government preemptively. The first attack is when Gov Whip says, well, other investigations will occur. Three things to say. First, opening government supports public impeachment. You are therefore tethered to their model. That means that necessarily it is large-scale public and all of the harms Ollie describes will occur. Second, the support increases the mandate and political capital. When Republicans actively come out and say, this is a thing we support, then you increase the ambit of those things necessarily. Third, those investigations you describe are far smaller and can centralize to specific states like New York. The second claim they make is to say, well, Republicans won't know you're the tipping point. Congratulations, you've not only just knifed your opening government, but also lost all of your benefits because all of their benefits are contingent upon that awareness. Opening government have better responses preemptively. The first they say is that criminal prosecution will occur anyway. 5 responses. Firstly, no, a supermajority of 2/3 is required in the Senate, which the Democrats don't have. Second, Biden is on record saying that he will not do so. Third, by your own analysis, a paltry number, only 26 Democrats are on record supporting it, which is nowhere near enough, enough to support that. Fourth, are harms carry anyway, for instance, party support. And fifth, more Republican support, like I said, increases the political capital of the investigation and justifies it being larger in scale. The second thing opening government says is that there will be a moderate fracture anyway. First, this is an assertion. Second, now there's likely to be multiple, so this harm it expands. And third, more moderate measures, like some condemnation, may appease both such groups. Similarly, closing government says, well, what about never Trumpers? Note that that group is extremely small and not on record as being likely to leave. They're all the responses to our extension. Let's go through why they win the debate. The first is to suggest, this is actually Ollie's second, is that information will be uncovered in such a way that it is likely to have massive widespread harm. First, we talk about the fact that Biden is in control and is likely to be zealous. Then we talk about the likelihood that co-conspirators will rat other people out. Not only for the self-preservation reason of saving your own bacon, but also because you feel actively betrayed by those other Republicans and want to rat them out for that reason. 4 impacts. First, there's spillover, so more Republicans go to jail. Second, you get active fracturing of the party. I'll discuss more in a second. Third, the investigation itself has massive long-term PR media damage. And fourth, major donors, people like the Adelsons and Melsons, who are extremely close to Trump, are probably pretty pissed off that their spillover is also attracting attention to them. That wins the debate on its own for the simple reason that you've made the most widespread damage to the political party itself. Second, we tell you it splits the party. Oliver gives you an enormous number of reasons, both with respect to the populace and to party members. No specific responses to any, except those blanket responses which I've dealt with. So, having established that, why does that win the debate? Well, it's the clearest path to failure and the long-term failure that closing government cares about as well, which is to say that it's hard to win elections in swing states when you have fewer people running in swing states, when you have fewer members of your party in totality, when you have those people like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz actively barracking against you and saying that you betrayed your party. So if you cared about electability, you needed a party in the first place. You didn't need these sorts of belligerents. So that's why we brought one. Let's talk about why CG loses. Let's start with CG's first extension, which is about justice. 2 responses, they're all that's required. I'll take you later, OG. The first is that this is an active debate. This actor is on record as not giving a single fuck about any of the things you care about. They supported Trump every step of the way. They supported the war on drugs. They support active gerrymandering and voter suppression. You haven't proven that they care principally about the things you care about. It's an active debate. Second, the principled interests that they do support, things like protecting, like abortion not being legal, require you to be in power, and therefore it's contingent upon the other stuff in the debate. The second extension is that Trump will run again if not prosecuted, long-term distancing. On the first one, 7 responses. First, he is unelectable, he is unlikely to run again. Second, this contradicts open government's analysis that Trump is extremely unpopular, and he therefore won't win the primaries. Third, Trump is fucking old. Fourth, by all accounts, read Fire and Fury, Trump does not enjoy being in the presidency, but prefers things like golf in Scotland. Fifth, if opening government is correct and he will be prosecuted anyway, this is entirely irrelevant. Sixth, this is only true if Trump is successfully prosecuted, and if he otherwise runs, he runs on opposition to the party and actively hates them. And seventh, other Republicans will actively barrack against him in order to diminish his chances of doing so. Note that this is their main path to victory of like this second extension, is proving that he will run again. They're unable to do so. If the party is chosen by the RNC, they're like the new candidate is chosen by the RNC, they're likely to align with the RNC's goals. Second part of their extension, a little bit on long-term distancing. My main observation here is that there are plenty of other ways to do this in very active ways, sort of as opening opposition talks about. You can just choose a new presidential candidate who is more moderate. You can actively condemn him in a series of other ways. So that is their 2 prongs of extension. They never prove why this specific thing is required for long-term distancing, other than asserting that he'll become president again. So with that out of the way, I'm going to move on to opening government and talk about the opening half in more detail. But before I do, opening government, hit me.
All of your reasons apply to impeachment, not a generic criminal investigation, which can take place at any point in the next 4 years. If this is done without RNC buy-in, then the RNC is much more likely to be investigated, which is the point of your whole extension.
No. Firstly, you guys supported impeachment, yeah? So you can't back away from it now. The second thing to say is that necessarily, when a party comes out and says, investigate this thing, then necessarily there is far, far more political will for that investigation than when they actively say this investigation is probably pretty irrelevant. So a lot of the reasons I gave earlier about the fact that these investigations are quite splintered also applies here. The other thing to note is even if they are imminent, we'd rather have more time to prepare for them, get legal counsel together, ensure that they are as weak as possible, rather than springing them initially. So even in that world, we still win. Opening government. The first thing they say is about electability. Note that our extension hurts your electability a lot more. I have 2 blanket responses here. The first is that there are a host of other ways to do this sort of electability. You can condemn certain practices, you can choose a more centrist candidate, you condemn the events of yesterday. The second thing to say is that there's a long time until the next Senate runoff in 2 years, which means you have plenty of time for the memory of the recent past to fade, to actively move on in this series of other ways. The next claim they make is that radicals like McConnell have condemned yesterday's actions. But 121 senators last week voted for the election to be overturned. Only months ago, they voted with near unanimity to not impeach him, which makes you look ridiculous when you come out and say, well, oh, actually, maybe we got it wrong, with no new evidence, except that he probably is guilty. Second, it makes sense because they cooperated and supported him. They are, as closing government says, complicit to some extent in these evil deeds. The final thing they say is twofold. The first is about the legislative agenda, but by your own analysis, the Democrats have a double majority, and therefore this is almost entirely irrelevant for the second reason, because by your own analysis, they hate you. So you have no impact in the formation of policy when you're in the Senate. The last thing I say is about demographic shift. This is probably their best material. 3 things. First, this also disfavors Republicans, like look, for instance, at the massive Hispanic bloc, which is anti-immigration and secured Trump's win in Florida. Second, there are good reasons for other changes, which can also appease these people, but it's never proven why it must be this specific one. And third, America for now remains largely white, and a lot of those people will have a visceral feeling of betrayal, which validates the deep state narrative, as Ollie tells you, noting that Trump supporters are not necessarily Republican supporters. So we win this debate in 3 ways. First, we engage the best responsibly. Secondly, we prove that you lose an enormous number of Republicans and lead to enormous Republican infighting. And third, we also prove that you get that the investigation will not only occur only in the government side, but that it will have enormous damages in that world. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, so I want to thank the opposition whip and all of the speakers in this debate. And I think that's it. If you all can then move out now, or if you're getting a breakout room, so we can deliberate. I think you all should move out, actually.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.